Here.
Vice Chair Schachner.
Here.
Representative Rohrcast.
Here.
Representative Stuck. Senator Tiffany, I'm sorry. Absent and excused. Nancy Dressel.
Here.
Stephen Dykstra.
Here.
Donna Hetmanik.
Here.
Ann Malone.
Here.
Dr. Warren is excused. Michael Weber is excused.
And I had a conversation with Senator Tiffany, and he let me know that he was not going to be here either, so I don't know what that means technically as to being excused or not. But a reminder to committee members and to guests, we are on WisconsinEye this morning, or I don't know, it may be a taped situation. I'm not sure if it's live or it's live, okay. And a reminder to silence your cell phones and other electronic devices or put them on vibrate. We have, the first order of business is the approval of minutes from the September 18th meeting. Have all members had a chance to review them, and are there any changes? Or I would take a motion to approve them.
Motion to approve. Second.
Okay.
Who was second? Nancy?
Yes.
Any, what do I say here? Any opposition to that?
Any objections?
Any objections to that? I knew there was a word that I was looking for. Looking for unanimous approval of the minutes. And so moved.
Voice vote.
Voice vote. You can tell I'm rusty, and maybe it is because I was a number of time zones away for a month or so. But in any case, we would like to, at this point, call a representative from the Wisconsin State Reading Association up. I think Deb Cromer will be joining us for this conversation, as that group has been in the past. So welcome. Thank you. It will be an interesting day today, a day where we are looking at putting some finishing touches, I hope, to a couple of pieces of legislation as well as recommendations. We may, after we get those done, just open it up for some conversation about additional thoughts that people have. But I do think it's best to get on the early end the pieces that we agreed on in the last meeting done. Before we start that, I'd like to have Legislative Counsel just go through the scope statement. I think one of our members had asked that be done, and I think that is appropriate, so that we don't wander too far off track, and so that we stay focused on what the scope and the charge initially was. So we'll have Julia from Legislative Counsel do that.
The study committee is directed to review current screening, identification, school intervention, and treatment protocols for dyslexia in K-12 schools, to examine the effects of current state statutes and regulations on literacy outcomes for students with dyslexia, and to evaluate the effects of dyslexia on literacy outcomes in the state. The committee shall study recent research on evidence-based instructional techniques for students with dyslexia, determine the components and costs of successful dyslexia education practices and laws in other states, and identify institutional obstacles to academic attainment for these students. The committee shall consider legislation to implement screening for characteristics of dyslexia in early grades to ensure that reading instruction and intervention practices incorporate relevant research findings from the University of Wisconsin, to improve the partnership between parents, educators, counselors, and others on early identification and effective interventions for dyslexic learners, and to enhance statewide access to updated resources and training on dyslexic education.
Thank you, Legislative Counsel. We have, as I indicated before, 2 pieces of legislation and then 3 recommendations that we agreed on last time to take up. And I think what we'll do is take those in the order that they are on your agenda. The first one is relating to developing a guidebook related to reading difficulties and dyslexia. But certainly I think we'll have some conversation about that as we move along. The second one is relating to employing a dyslexia specialist at Department of Public Instruction and making an appropriation, and then the recommendations, lifetime licensure alternative licensure, and grade ranges for educator licenses. And I would remind the committee that the recommendations are just that. They're just recommendations. They're things that we discussed here. They are not going to be proposed legislation at this point. Some of these changes were recent. I know that Dr. Weber and I had a conversation yesterday wherein he indicated as a superintendent that to change what had been recently changed again would be difficult to do. I'll also remind the committee that the pieces of legislation, the two pieces of legislation that we have are not, that doesn't mean when we pass them, if we pass them out of committee here, that they will become law. They will go through the standard legislative process after the beginning of next session. They'll be introduced as bills from Legislative Council, and they will go through the standard hearing process, and there will be ample opportunity to work with those pieces as they come out at that point as well. But before I get too far along the way, I should have opened it up to see if Vice Chair Schottner would have anything to add, either about the direction she sees for the day here or anything in general that you would want to share.
I think that this process has opened all of our eyes to the topic of dyslexia and reading difficulties, and I'm looking forward to see how we can all come together to really focus on what's best for kids. At the end of the day, that's why we're here, to really figure out what's best for kids.
And I think it might also be appropriate to just give other members of the committee just a minute or so to talk about what is about this process and just to open it up that way. As you know, I have a little bit of a free spirit and like to have free dialogue going back and forth. So if you're prepared to do that, we'll start with Dr. Dykstra. And just, again, a minute or two, don't want to take a lot of time on this, but just kind of what your thoughts have been.
I'm concerned, as we go through the scope statement, I'm concerned about the many things that we're not touching on, we didn't review. It said that we shall study methods of successful intervention. We never did that. We seem to be kicking that down the road. I'm also concerned that we appear to be, we're supposed to be studying and talking about dyslexia, but we have entertained a lot of concerns from groups who dispute the importance and the existence of dyslexia, the utility of that word. I think we need to get back to our purpose, which is to really look at what works with dyslexia, to put information out about dyslexia, and to focus on that important charge.
Representative Rohrkast, do you have anything to add, or if you don't, that's fine too. I know I'm putting
Just a
people on the spot.
couple of comments. I mean, I think that the recommendations are a good starting point, but as to what Mr. Dykstra said, I do have some questions of, have we gone far enough? And, so I think some of the testimony begs the question that more work will need to be done to look at this. I hear from people in my district on kind of both sides as to what Mr. Dykstra said. Parents very concerned that we need to be doing something different, something special for people with dyslexia. And then others that, as they've raised the concerns here, is looking at it that maybe, well, they're already doing enough. So I guess to me, the bottom line is we still have children who may not be getting the right training and right education in some way, and we have to keep looking at better ways to do that. So I like where we've started, but I don't think that we have gone maybe as far as what we will need to look at.
Thank you. Donna Hetmanick?
I agree with what Dr. Dykstra said, and in looking at the scope, we only have covered 6 out of 14 elements of the scope, and so in my mind, that is not even half of what we had set out to do. The the problem we've been hearing and debating about is what to do with dyslexic kids. And I think the word dyslexia needs to be put back into schools, and people need to use that word. In my experience, it's not used. It's not encouraged to be used. So I would really like to see that we embrace the word dyslexia, and we find the right treatment for kids with dyslexia and put the special back into special education. Thank you.
Thank you. Nancy Dressel?
Thank you. I too, as I was reviewing our work last night, found myself wondering if we were falling short. I think the idea of a guidebook and bringing together key partners and having that process of bringing together stakeholders and then communicating to parents is essential. But it's very possible that even with a guidebook and the support of a dyslexia specialist, the word dyslexia could still not be used in schools. And, currently, neurological disorders such as attention deficit disorder, autism, anxiety, and depression are not only used in schools, but are supported and treated in schools. And so I don't think we can allow dyslexia to stay separated from that. And so I too am wondering where we're at and if we've addressed our scope.
Okay, thank you. Ann Malone?
I also agree with Stephen Dykstra. I think that the place to start is to put into this law the definition of dyslexia. I would recommend the IDA definition just as a good one. I understand that we can't get everything in one piece of legislation. I support the 3 recommendations from the WSRA. I do think that reading is complex and that teachers, administrators need professional development as to awareness of what dyslexia is, as well as what has been shown over and over again to work for dyslexia. If I can just relate a little, I went for 20-some years in the schools not knowing much about dyslexia, not making the link as being a speech and language therapist with oral language and written language, and I wish I had. It is complex, but we have to start somewhere, because what we know about dyslexia is that these kids can be identified early and that given intensive, with fidelity, remediation, they can become readers, which I never knew. I thought all we could do is accommodate. So the schools are called upon to treat dyslexia in a different way than they treat almost everything else. Almost everything else is accommodation. So dyslexia is the one condition where we can actually do the treatment, if you will, in our schools. But we do need professional development for teachers who are already out there. We need standards within the School of Education to just make people aware of the science behind dyslexia. But a good place to start would be a definition of dyslexia, screening for dyslexia, and what is successful intervention for dyslexia. If we could get those on the book, I'd be very happy.
Representative Stuck, do you have anything to add?
So, I'll admit I didn't know much about this issue coming in, which is why I thought it was sort of interesting. And I've certainly learned a lot just in terms of the divide there seems to be between parents feeling like they really are not supported, don't know what to do when this happens in their family, and teachers really feeling like they're doing their best and feeling almost a little attacked, it seems like, by this, as though they're being blamed, which I think is unfortunate, because I think there's some ways to support both sides, support our teachers, better give them resources, better support our schools, and at the same time find a better way to support our parents so they don't feel like they're sort of alone on this struggle. So I think this is a good start, but again, hopefully, I think as been said by everybody, we can continue to do more on this.
Thank you. Deb Cromer, please.
First of all, I want to say that I appreciate being here today. And Kathy Champeau is the person that would have been here today, but she is not back from her trip, so I am here in her place. But I do represent the WSRA, the Wisconsin State Reading Association. But what I'd like for you to know about me is I have 40 years of experience as a teacher. All 40 of those years have been spent working directly with children. And most recently, for most of my career, I've been working with children as readers. And I always appreciate when the legislature turns an eye to education and to working with educators and the community to find ways to better serve the children of our state. Because public education is a foundation of our democracy, and we need to make sure that teachers and educators and school boards have all the resources that they can to make sure that all children are successful. And I know that those of you who have been here and are on this committee, that you do appreciate the struggles of children and their families, and understand that, and that we need to be doing something to make sure that they are successful. As a teacher, I want to highlight, though, what Representative Stuck says, that we are in dire need of resources to work with all of our children, and especially when they struggle. Professional learning is something that we are continually in need of. We need to make sure that we have time and the materials that we need in order to work with all children. And we need to make sure that we are able to give students whatever they need when they need it. My concern, and the concern of the Wisconsin State Reading Association, though, is that we don't want to restrict what kinds of demands we put on teachers that would not allow them to do the best things that they can for the kids in front of them. And so today I'm going to have in front of me faces and names and profiles of children that I've worked with through the years to remind me of what they've needed when they've needed it. And those needs change with instruction and experience. And I just want to make sure that this committee, those of you who have a vote, I have a small voice here today, but not a vote, but that the discussion helps all of you and the legislature, when they receive these bills, to make wise decisions for children, so that teachers and parents and communities and school boards have what they need to make sure that all children are helped when they need it. Thank you.
Thank you, appreciate that. I think that hopefully was helpful to just have everyone have a minute or two. The Legislative Council reminded me that I'm the chair, so I can make it as crazy as I want to here today. So I'll try not to do that more than necessary. The drafts of legislation that we have in front of us, there's a couple of ways that this committee could go today. We could either, if there are minor tweaks, Legislative Council has told me that they are actually likely able to make those changes over the lunch hour. And there is a possibility, if it's good for the committee and good for all of us, that we could actually vote on these and not have a meeting in December 4th. There's also the chance that there will need to be some major reshuffling and reshaking of them, in which case we will still stay on task to have a meeting on December 4th. So we'll kind of see how that plays out along the way. And because I am, again, new to this territory, this piece of territory, I may on occasion say, let's take a 5-minute break and we will consult with Senator Schottner and Ledge Council and try to figure out what direction it is. So if that looks like it's disjointed and discombobulated, it is, well, it is, and it's by design so that we get this right, because that's the most critical thing to me as we're moving along. So we have the LRB 0383/P3. Could we have Legislative Council just discuss that for us, and then we will open it up for discussion, changes, and tweaks.
So there are a lot of details in this bill, as I'm sure you guys have seen if you've had a chance to read it. So I think it would be most appropriate for me to provide a high-level overview of just what the bill does very generally, and then take questions as they come up during committee discussion. This bill requires DPI to develop a guidebook for parents, guardians, teachers, and administrators regarding dyslexia and students who struggle with reading. To develop the guidebook, the state superintendent of DPI must establish an advisory committee whose membership shall be determined in consultation with WSRA and IDA. After the advisory committee is formed, the committee has 1 year to submit to DPI a draft guidebook that contains certain information specified in the bill. DPI must publish the final product within 3 months after it receives the draft guidebook from the advisory committee. School boards that maintain an internet site must include a link to the guidebook on their website. Finally, DPI must review the guidebook once every 3 years in consultation with WSRA and IDA.
One of the things that Brenda Warren mentioned relative to this guidebook is that if school districts post this immediately after DPI produces it, there might be a lack of knowledge and of understanding on the side of the school district or ability to help. I'm just throwing that out to get things started. I know many of the rest of you have other input relative to either the makeup of the committee or those kinds of things. But is that a concern that we should, I think it is a concern that we should talk about at least, that more time for school districts to put this on their websites? Go ahead, Dr. Dykstra.
I think I'm concerned about that as well as Dr. Warren was. But I think we have to acknowledge that if we're saying we're concerned about that, we're acknowledging that schools and teachers and principals and administrators are very likely to be confronted with information that is new to them, that they don't know what to do, and that we have to at some point step up and embrace it directly rather than indirectly. This acknowledgement that, that we were called to give teachers resources. I desperately want teachers to have resources. I spend a lot of time in schools that don't have the resources. But one of the resources that they don't have is accurate and complete information. And that's an essential resource that doesn't cost anything. We just have to give, and we have to start to acknowledge that when we're concerned that people are going to get this guidebook and not know what to do, that is the core of the problem.
Just giving more time, though, and writing that into the bill probably isn't the kind of thing that really would be, if you just say 3 months after DPI publishes it, school
Right.
districts have to do it. Is that 3 months spent in becoming familiar with it enough to give direction to parents? Or, so I guess I don't know how to handle that in terms of giving legislative council further direction.
We
Relative
find ourselves
time.
back at the professional development question, which is very difficult to address because it's not inexpensive.
Go ahead,
I think sorry.
Go ahead, Ann. You
Yeah,
go first.
Ann, go ahead.
I think releasing the guidebook, not only should DPI publish it, but they should be required to put it on their website. It will cause problems in terms of people become more aware that we don't know, or that many teachers, many administrators don't know what's already out there.
I think DPI is actually, in the bill draft, DPI is required to put it on their website as well.
Okay,
So,
good.
yeah.
Good. And as Dr. Dykstra said, I guess I'm just repeating it, that the problem's already out there, and the professional development is necessary, and it is possible to acquire it. So, raising awareness or allowing parents to have some information about just what is going on can only be good in the end.
And I'll just say that, let's not just speak on that topic. If there are others, we can be kind of free-flowing and other ideas to make this a better bill. So, Donna?
Okay, so I'm going to go out on a limb here. What about putting together some sort of module, internet module that could be accessible by all, about dyslexia, about interventions, about what to do with kids, how to identify it, how it's screened, this sort of thing that would be required for all personnel that work with students to be viewed.
Go ahead, Senator Sutter.
As I'm listening to this, I think the disconnect here is the fact that if we have this go out to the school districts and DPI, part of this is informing the school boards. The school boards then set the tone for the in-services, and it all can be done pretty easily just by routing that communication. As a former school board member, that was part of our charge, was to make sure that we had the information on training and that. So having this as part of the part of this responsibility is the local school boards to, that it will be done, involves that local piece.
Does that require what you're suggesting? Because I think I followed it, but does that require any additions or changes to the bill draft the way it is?
I don't think so.
So it's just more a matter of
It's
the
just
process of it
education
working out.
process, yeah.
And to Donna, I understand what you're saying relative to a module. Are there other states that have done that? And is that something that could be relatively easily put together, or?
Yes, in fact, I've looked at several states. California has a very extensive one. It's an hour long. There's 2 of them. I'm not sure that's the route we want to go. We want to make it teacher-friendly, user-friendly, in a short amount of time. Texas has one, Iowa has one, South Carolina, Virginia. I've looked at all of those. Some are better than others. It could be easily done. It could be easily duplicated. It is on the web. It's free information, so we wouldn't have a problem with duplication. Where I see it being valuable is we could hit all the teachers that work with kids, school teachers, administrators, reading specialists, special education teachers, speech and language pathologists, school psychologists, counselors, social workers. They'd have to view this and upon completion get a certificate for it. It would be, I don't know if some of you have been in school districts where you have to watch the blood-borne pathogen video, and you turn it on, you let it roll, and then you turn it off, and yep, did it. It shouldn't have to be that way. It should be proof that you completed it with some sort of certification. And this would be needed to ensure that all teachers, yes, listen to it and know the content. And even, it's just an awareness level. If we had that awareness level, and again, as I said previously, is using the word dyslexia and knowing what you're talking about. Oh my, I have kids in my classroom that have dyslexia. They're called learning disabled kids. So it's the same concept. So what do I do with those kids? Okay, now you know.
The challenge that I would see with that, and I agree with what you're saying, but where do teachers find time? They are already the most awesome human beings there are, and you are one as well, so.
Thank you.
Just
It's too important not to find time for it. If we're missing between 5 and 15%, maybe even closer to 20% of the population of kids that we're not servicing properly, that's just wrong.
Deb, go ahead.
Yes, I understand that idea, but my concern is one of time as well. And yes, I do think teachers need to make time to learn how to work with children who struggle. That's a continual problem that I have, that I'm working with children every day, and I'm constantly trying to learn more so that I can work with the human variation that's in front of me. one of the things that I'm concerned about, though, is a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. And in a time of reinstated lifetime licensure and demands on districts for things such as the bloodborne pathogens video and school safety initiatives, all of the things that are coming at us from outside that are very important, but we need depth of knowledge as well as awareness, and we need to make sure that we have the knowledge to work with each and every child with the strengths and needs that they bring to us. And I'm just concerned that something that is fairly contained and has a short time frame that people would need to be watching it, that the problem-solving nature of teaching might be substitute that we might not be able to think about things in depth enough to help children solve the problems that they have as readers. And I'm just very concerned that it lends itself to a one-size-fits-all approach if we have something that's very short in duration that everybody would be required to do, and would not lend itself to the complexity of what we're about.
Would it be possible to have as a module, we've been to some extent not super prescriptive with regards to the content of the guidebook. Would it be possible to have that be a prescription for a component of the guidebook, that you have a module in it? I don't know if that's plausible, or, Stephen Dykstra, go ahead.
So a couple of things. I see the initial brief module as really serving to correct what we've seen here as widespread misinformation, that there is such a wide-ranging number of definitions of dyslexia that it's kind of a useless concept. It's not true. It's easily corrected. Misrepresentations of the research. For instance, it's been said that, Marianne Wolf disputes what dyslexia is compared to other people. It's just not true. We can fix that dyslexia is a medical diagnosis. We can fix that. The dyslexia isn't covered in the DSM or by the APA. That's not true. We can fix that. So it would go through those things, provide a definition and a starting point. I agree that going deeper is better. And what I can say, I can't commit to this because it's not my money, but I'm reasonably confident we can gain access to private funding to produce as many deep, complete, thorough, fabulous, professional, top flight modules and videos about this as anybody would want. So we can go as deep as you want to go. You don't have to worry about being shallow. We can go as deep as you want to go. I'll tell you right now, there's no question in my mind we could have access to the top people in the world of reading and dyslexia who would help us to do this at no cost to the state of Wisconsin and make those publicly available at no cost. We'll go as deep as you want to go.
Go ahead, Donna.
I think what we need to do is to get the initial module out there, because again, it's that misunderstanding of what we're dealing with. Once that happens, I totally agree with you, Deb. We need to go deep, and that gets back into the teacher training that we so sorely need. Deep is going to really solve problems, and I actually have some ideas for that too. And my thoughts, I'm sorry, I can't think of what else I was going to say, so I'll pass.
Deb, and then Ann.
Yeah, and I appreciate your understanding my need for depth. As a teacher, I have long had a problem with, what do we do on Monday, and professional development initiatives that are one-shot deals that don't really help inform teachers about what we can do to really work with children who struggle. My concern is, though, that there are a number of perspectives, and there are a number of people who do research, and I want to make sure that not one particular little piece of that is privileged at the expense of others.
I would be talking about the perspective on dyslexia that you find in the work of the National Academy of Sciences, the National Reading Panel, National Institutes of Health, all the major medical organizations of the English-speaking world. I would be talking about that perspective on dyslexia.
Go ahead, Ann.
I appreciate that there are many struggling readers. I appreciate that DPI came to us and told us about all the problems they have, across the state, whether it's poverty or ESL or there's a million things going on in our schools. I understand. But we are the study committee on dyslexia. And struggling readers actually makes it too broad. I'd accept that if the guidebook remains focused on what dyslexics need. And most of your SLD kids are dyslexics. We're really talking about the same thing. Also, Tony Evers, I do have a letter from him that says, we can use the term dyslexia. It's from the DPI. So, it's time we define dyslexia and we raise awareness for parents, teachers, administrators as to what it is and what works best. And the research and the science is out there. And I don't want to take away from anyone else. I want to add specific intervention that will really help a huge chunk of kids. So, I don't want to fight. I want to come together on this. But I do think that broadening our scope is a big problem. I think we need to stick with what we are about, which is dyslexia, and it is a big bunch of kids. So thank you.
And I'm just thinking about, our process here today and thinking about the specific piece of legislation for developing the guidebook. The title of this is related to reading difficulties and dyslexia. I think I heard a couple of people suggest that that is too broad. Is that the consensus of the committee? Shall we be narrowly focused in only dyslexia for this guidebook? That is language of the title of the bill, and I do want to try to get, because I think we agreed last time that this is one of the pieces that we want to do. So I know we're talking about the whole of it. I don't know how much further we can go than just zeroing in on potentially the makeup of the advisory committee that's doing it and making sure this legislation is good, and then we can take up the modules and the other things at possibly another point. Possibly that'll have to be standalone legislation that individual lawmakers do. Again, I'm really kind of struggling as to exactly what the direction is that we need to take here, but I do know that I do want to get done with getting the drafts narrowed down here. So, Donna?
I have two comments. One is, we all came to consensus this morning that the scope of the study was not being addressed completely. 6 out of 14 areas were covered. Two, in terms of the inclusion of the word struggling, the scope of our study was dyslexia. If we include struggling readers, we are opening it up to all struggling readers based on poverty or struggling readers based on experience or on ESL, all struggling readers. I would propose that the term dyslexia and or dyslexia-like conditions or characteristics be replace struggling readers.
I think I'm hearing from a majority of the committee to drop the reading difficulties out of the title there. So it would read, relating to developing a guidebook related to dyslexia. Is that, is there any, no, that's not what we're saying here. So I'm directing legislative council to do that, and at the end of the day, we'll have a yes or a no vote, so we can do that.
Could it say dyslexia and related conditions? Because then we're talking about, you know,
Modeling on the Minnesota guidebook as instructed.
Struggling with reading, okay. So this, yeah, the Minnesota actually says navigating the school system when a child is struggling with reading or dyslexia.
Can I say something?
Go ahead, Donna.
DPI has already put out a PowerPoint called Teaching Our Readers When They Struggle. It's 130 pages long. Struggling readers, according to DPI, has already been covered. This is specific legislation for dyslexia.
Okay. Deb, are you?
Yeah, I'm just struggling here. I do believe that there are students who are dyslexic. I'm not denying that. I do believe that there are students who have profound struggles, and it affects them and their families. And as a reading teacher, I want to be able to help any child who struggles, no matter what their label is, diagnosis, why they are struggling. And I understand that there are children and families who believe that that focusing narrowly on dyslexic students will help with this situation. But I do know from my reading and from the reading that those of us in WSRA have been doing, that there is not consensus in the community of dyslexia organizations about, not just the definition, but what should be done to help students. And the National Reading Panel and other bodies that have looked at the research on reading also say there is no one best way. There is no one profile of students who are dyslexic or struggling, and there's disagreement when I look on some of the websites. One of the websites I found said that focused instruction on phonics may be harmful to some dyslexic students. So I'm worried that by being so restrictive in this guidebook and in the kinds of things that are promoted. For instance, the things promoted by the Orton Society as the organization that seems to be the one that's pointed out most often, that we could be causing harmful impact for some students. I'm very aware that there are side effects to things that we do, just as in the medical profession. There are side effects to procedures and medications that we need to consider, and that we need to be very careful that the things that we are prescribing don't do harm. And I'm not saying that anybody on this committee intends anything, but we really have to be careful about the decisions we make and whether or not we're taking something that we're taking out students who struggle, but the kinds of things that you're proposing may impact other children in general education and other children who struggle with reading. And that is of concern to me.
The point was made that we have already a guidebook relative to struggling readers. I guess I'm going to make a suggestion to just see how this fits. It's the suggestion that was made over here that we say relating to developing a guidebook related to dyslexia, and what was the finish on that? Other and related conditions. Does that, because, we don't want to duplicate what's already been done. And, if you have, that's in my estimation, would that be a change that the committee could vote on affirmatively at some point?
Yes.
Dyslexia and related conditions. Can we make that
Yes.
make that change? Excellent. Let's talk about the the makeup of this advisory committee. I know some of you have some thoughts on that, and in an effort to move along the conversation, is there input on that relative to the makeup of the advisory committee?
I'm very concerned that, DPI and WSRA have presented a great, for a number of hours to this committee, more than anybody else. The general trends were, we're not sure about this diagnosis, we're not sure about this label, we think it's very vague. With all due respect to Ms. Comer, a lot of what she just said right now is really an example of the misrepresentations of dyslexia and the false information that needs to be corrected. So I'm really concerned about giving so much control over dyslexia guidebook to groups that have stated very clearly that they're not sure dyslexia is real or it's a useful concept. It wasn't that long ago that WSRA wrote an official position about dyslexia and circulated it in the legislature that said, nobody knows what it is, it's not a useful concept, don't worry about it. If you're going to write a dyslexia guidebook, you're going to spend a lot of time worrying about things like phonics and phonemic awareness. It wasn't that long ago that WSRA's official position on phonemic awareness was it wasn't important, you can read well without it. They said the importance of phonemic awareness was a myth. That was an official position of their organization. I think they've moved away from that, but that's only very recently. And it concerns people in the dyslexia community, concerns me a great deal, that we're going to take people who testified over and over again, really questioning the utility of the concept of dyslexia, and now give them a major voice in writing a dyslexia guidebook.
Could Legislative Council be specific as to how this would roll out in terms of how the players, if you will, would be chosen in the advisory committee? I don't think you did that in your initial brief.
Right.
So, yeah, if you don't mind, please do that.
This is how the advisory committee process, the selection would work. So, within 30 days after publication of the bill, IDA and WSRA would each have to submit a list of 3 names that they would want to represent their organization on the committee. 30 days after that time, the state superintendent of DPI would have to select from each one of those lists a representative from IDA and WSRA and appoint that person, one from each organization, and each would serve as co-chairs on the advisory committee. 30 days after that, IDA and WSRA would have to submit a list of 20 names that they wish to represent or be representatives on the committee. Now, those 20 names must be individuals who could fit into the categories, if you have your draft in front of you, specified in the bill on pages 3 and 4. Categories such as a parent of a child with dyslexia, a parent of a child who is struggling reading, an individual with dyslexia, etc. 30 days after that, DPI would determine whether or not the lists submitted by IDA and WSRA are complete and sufficient to appoint all members. If they're not sufficient, DPI would immediately notify members of each organization, and then they would have 30 days to resubmit names. At the end of 6 months after this process, all membership must be appointed by DPI. So DPI would be responsible for picking 8 individuals from each list submitted by WSRA and IDA to fill the seats of the advisory committee. And then again, after the committee is appointed, it would have 1 year to complete its charge of submitting a draft to DPI.
Thank you. And what I've heard actually from both sides is that it's tilted the other direction. I am unsure how it can be tilted from the other direction other than in perception. To me, it seems like, and I'm not pointing anyone out specifically right now, but just it seems to me that it's a fairly even process as I see it, and represents two of the primary stakeholder groups. Am I wrong in that? And I guess the follow-up question, if I don't need you to issue a judgment on am I wrong or not, but are there any people or groups or that are missing from the list of people that will comprise the advisory committee? So, Deb, go ahead, and then Nancy.
I just need to say a few things. First of all, I'm concerned about the makeup of this committee. Because if you're talking about imbalance, there is an illusion that WSRA has a voice at this table. We do have a small voice, and we have been invited to recommend and to a speaker. Donna Scanlon was the person that we recommended. We also had a presentation last time by Kathy Shampo, our legislative committee chair. So we have had opportunities to present testimony, but we have no vote. We have no vote other than on this committee. We've only had some opportunities to present testimony. And we have also been mischaracterized in terms of our positions. I don't think there's anybody that I know of in WSRA who would say that children don't need phonics instruction, or that we wouldn't teach phonemic awareness. I'm working every day with children, and I'm spending a lot of time on phonics and phonemic awareness in many ways, through writing, through other activities that I do with them. I don't neglect it. And I think it would be terrible to do that. I wouldn't do that to a child who's struggling and who needs that. But I wouldn't spend time doing phonics instruction with someone who is reading and doing very well at it. That would be a waste of their time. So I'm very concerned that that we have been mischaracterized, that we don't have a voice in a vote in this forum, and that although there is an appearance of having a voice and having a part in developing this guidebook through that statement about appointing or recommending half of the participants, the list of the advisory committee categories means that again, it's another illusion that we would actually be able to recommend people who are experts, who have the expertise in reading and literacy, to be a part of this process in a substantial way. So I think it's very concerning, and I don't think that if I took this legislation back to my board, that they would see that we have any legitimate voice and part of the process at all.
Well, and I will remind the committee that I wasn't in charge of selecting the committee, and that I'm simply trying to get some kind of consensus on something that works. Sounds to me, though, that you would be a no vote. Is that what I'm hearing, if you did have a vote? Or
Well,
what could we do to make it so that you would be, and your organization would be on board with what we're looking at doing here?
Well,
And I know that's a cheeky question, but I'm trying
I think we would really appreciate being able to recommend half. But I think that what we would go along with is if that list of participants, starting with a representative of the Department of Public Instruction. I know that's one that's not a part of the dividing it into WSRA and IDA recommended committee members. But the others, I think if they were a list of suggested categories, that if we were able to come up with a list of people that we consider to be experts who could address this issue effectively, who've studied it intensely and would be able to devote the time to really thinking through what would be helpful to parents and to educators and to administrators, who would be able to formulate a guidebook that would give people the tools they need to make wise decisions for children. I think we could go along with that, but as
So
it's written right now, I don't think we can.
So you're suggesting that we're being too prescriptive as to who is on it, that we should just drop some of the prescription?
Yes, I think that the prescriptiveness really is disingenuous. I mean, it looks like we've got half the recommendations, but when you look at the specific people that categories of people, there's not a way that we could actually come up with a list of, I mean, we could come up with a list of people who would be experts and would be able to guide the development of this guidebook, but you know, for instance, you've got 3 organizations there that are all associated with the Orton Society, Decoding Dyslexia, the International Dyslexia Association, the Wisconsin Reading Coalition, and then there's one organization, WSRA, that is different from that, giving another perspective. So many of these individuals on here are all coming from one perspective. You know, I thought this study committee was a part of a legislature that's part of a democratic process. And a democratic process means that you have multiple perspectives and that you value dissent in
Again,
order
I'll-
to
I'll-
come to a logical, wise, reasonable decisions about things for the good of all.
Again, I'm sorry to have inserted myself, but, you know, I'm not responsible for that piece of it, and I'm just trying to understand it here. So I'd prefer not to plow the ground a dozen times in the same location. Nancy, go ahead.
Thank you. For myself, the discussion that's occurring right now is reflective of one of our initial discussions on could we simply adopt the Minnesota guidebook, or did we need to go through a process ourselves? And one of the challenges that we're struggling with right now is that in Minnesota, this process was initiated by their Department of Education, not through legislation. And the presenter herself talked about how they considered abandoning the process because it's that difficult. And in the end, they were all committed as individuals to taking that information that they came to consensus on and to presenting it at other committees. Wisconsin is coming to this topic in a different format. And so I'm starting to feel that legislation that assigns the process of creating the guidebook potentially isn't appropriate in this environment because dyslexia really is a civil rights issue, a civil liberties issue, that students who have this diagnosis are not, even though the DPI has guidance on it, being afforded their civil liberties to be able to learn in their school environment. And we are broadening this discussion by including struggling readers, by trying to bring people to the table. And consistently, people have demonstrated that they don't want to be at this table to discuss dyslexia. And so I think if we return to the scope of this committee, and that this committee was intended to consider legislation to implement screening for characteristics of dyslexia in early grades, to ensure that reading instruction and intervention practices incorporate relevant research findings from the University of Wisconsin, and to improve the partnership between parents and educators. That needs to be our focus. I think a guidebook might be a part of that, and maybe that's a part of a dyslexia specialist supporting actual legislation on those topics. But it appears to me that this committee needs to address legislation specifically on those topics.
And I think that is certainly a noble thought, and I appreciate what you said. I think the difficulty comes in to the political nature of this is such that this committee is comprised of, as Deb pointed out, people that tend to see one side of the issue. So this was an attempt to say, let's do something that is more collaborative, put together legislation that's more collaborative to put together an advisory committee. It was kind of a punt, actually, but it was likely the only thing that could get done, simply because that is, it's always difficult to communicate effectively to people who aren't legislators how goofy and how messed up this process actually can appear to be from the outside. And so again, what we're trying to do is to put together something that actually will move the ball in the direction. I'm going to be honest, we're not going to be able to do the touchdown on this one. It just isn't going to happen. I would love for it to, but it's a matter of the way the process works out is slow, methodical, sometimes really screwed up. Just saying. Ann.
Thank you. I think WSRA has had more time at the mic than any of us on this committee. I almost came here with a piece of duct tape and rope because I feel like my mouth has been silenced by we have to ask a question, we can't make a statement, and I feel like my hands have been tied. So they've had presenters, they've had more time at the mic than anyone here. And personally, we are the study committee on dyslexia. I want WSRA at the table. I want to communicate with them, but I do not want to be hijacked with a 50-50 situation. When you first started this committee, people could attend, but they couldn't speak. It was just, we were listening to presentation, we were talking. Now it has changed immensely. I want struggling reading gone. I would like to have a definition of dyslexia in our bill. That's something that doesn't cost us anything. It could be added. And as far as selecting the writing committee, it sounds like we're not going to get our dyslexia specialist because that's funded and that's going to be a problem. So if we give all the control to DPI to do all of the selecting, that's a problem. Maybe DPI and the Wisconsin branch of IDA get to select the committee. We are the committee on dyslexia. We are not the committee on struggling reading or reading across the state. So I really want to keep coming back to that. I do want you at the table. I really, really do. I want to hear from you. I want to also have you hear from us. So, okay, I'm done. Go Stephen.
And yes, go ahead, Donna.
And I think your point of having a definition for dyslexia is absolutely correct. Other states, Connecticut, I believe, has put in on the IEP a box that says dyslexia. That is actually giving a name to that disability, and it gives a name and it gives ways to look at what the treatment is, very specific for that disability. The other thing I want to make a point of, and Deb, you mentioned that you would not teach phonics to a student. Phonics is a waste of their time for struggling, for kids that are reading, and I have to disagree with you. If we don't teach systematic phonics to students all through their elementary grades, those kids will not possibly be good spellers or readers.
I didn't say I wouldn't teach it to. No, but I do need to.
I'm sorry, I object.
No,
There's a
what?
procedure to this committee that everyone has had.
Yes.
Sorry.
There is a procedure that we've had to follow.
There is. I've let it get away from us a little bit. And to your point earlier of of the statements or the questions rather than the statements on the early end and the invited speakers. That's the typical format for Ledge Council study committees. That's the way it's done. It's the bill will have a public hearing. Any bills that we actually can agree on today will have a public hearing at a certain point, and then the public will be allowed to speak. But the normal format is for the people on the standing committees within the assembly to ask questions, not to make statements. Now, the things have changed, yes. Now we are not in that time. We are in a time when we can hopefully agree on some draft legislation that we actually will put out. I haven't been over here for a while, so
I feel like I'm holding down this whole side of the room. Multiple officers of the WSRA spoke. People may not be aware that Barb Novak, who spoke for DPI, is a past high-ranking officer of the WSRA. Colleen Pinnell is an officer of the WSRA. We've been told that dyslexia is opaque, that it can't be seen, it can't be understood, it's invisible, it's opaque. We've been told falsely, and I'm sorry to use that word, that the APA says it's not a real diagnosis. They absolutely don't say that. We've had researchers like Linnea Airy and Marianne Wolf miscited, badly miscited. I think those were honest mistakes. I want to be very clear about that. I think those were honest mistakes. I'm glad to hear that Ms. Comer supports the teaching of phonemic awareness, but you know it wasn't that long ago that your organization is still listed as its #1 point for advocacy and had listed for over a decade, making sure that everybody knew that phonemic awareness, the importance of phonemic awareness was a myth, and compared it to the stories of alligators in big city sewers. That was an official position of, I have documents here from the last time we tried to recommend screening for dyslexia, and they said, you can't screen for dyslexia, it's a bad idea. You'll harm kids just by screening for it. When we recommended screening for phoneme awareness, and WSRA's position was that phoneme awareness, plenty of kids read fine who don't have phoneme awareness. So I'm glad to see that we've seen some progress. We have to take note of the fact that an organization came before us time and time again and has said, we're not sure dyslexia is real. They pointed out that that in a meeting organized in La Crosse, that one of their subgroups was spending a lot of time studying a book by Elliott and Grigorenko. They were studying a book about dyslexia. Elliott and Grigorenko dispute the utility of the diagnosis of dyslexia and whether it's a worthwhile thing. So their first foray, their first professional development foray into dyslexia is to entertain the notion that it maybe doesn't really exist and that it isn't a useful thing. I agree they need to be at the table. But giving them equal say, and understand, allowing DPI to select the membership of the committee does not give, that essentially is DPI. When WSA wrote those 2 position papers for the legislature about 9 years ago, DPI and the WEA both deferred to them. They both said, whatever their position is, that's our position. So to give people who dispute the existence of dyslexia, the utility of the diagnosis, who consistently misstate the research, who consistently misrepresent the diagnostic criteria, who see minor discussions around the fringe of dyslexia as somehow undermining the utility of the diagnosis, which goes on with, those same discussions go on with every other diagnosis there is, diabetes, arthritis, heart disease, everything else. But nobody disputes that those are useful concepts. Yet here we're going to take people who say the earth might be flat, and we're going to give them half the seats at a commission to develop a guidebook on the teaching of geography. That's essentially what we're talking about doing. Now, do they need to be in the room? I think they need to be in the room because we need to hear their feedback. When we write something that they don't understand, when we write something that's different than what they know, we need to know about that so that we do a better job of it, so that they can understand it and see the utility in it. But giving them half the seats just denies everything that's gone on in front of us for the past several meetings and everything that's gone on in this debate for the last 10 years.
Well, one of the things that I want to just insert here is that it is that we have DPI picking the members for this because it's not possible for the legislature to direct a non-public entity to put together something of this nature. So that's one of the reasons that DPI is there. And, you know, and I understand, Dr. Dykstra, you're saying that I completely understand what you're saying. The other side, although they'll tell me that that they are the ones who are not at half. So at a certain point, I guess I have to ask the question. We have a piece of proposed legislation in front of us. What I'm hearing all around the table is no's for it. So it's better to do absolutely nothing than it is to do something. Is that what I'm, because if that's the case, we're all going to go home early here, and I'm going to be very disappointed.
I'm
But
not.
it's not about my disappointment, don't get me wrong.
No,
I'm just,
I want a guidebook. I think there are excellent guidebooks. Personally, I've looked at a bunch of them. I don't think Minnesota is one of them. I think there are some excellent guidebooks. I think we could, if we're going to stay at half and half, and we're going to allow DPI to choose the members, which I think is dangerous. I think it's really dangerous.
sorry to insert, but I'm going to take the
that's fine.
chair piece. You'll have the ability to submit 20 names. Are there 20 names within the dyslexia community that you would see as viable and valid sources
Yeah.
for your point of view?
Yeah.
So if that's the case and DPI picks 8 of those, do you care which 8 they pick? Yes. So you have to be really careful as to the choosing of those so that you have all top quality candidates. I understand, I understand what you're saying, but you do get 8 picks there, and I would hope that they would be compelling enough to make good cases. Ann?
My concern is that DPI, it's written in here, if they don't like our choices, they can send us back to the drawing table until we come up with names they like. So I'd almost rather just recommend 8 names for DPI and say, DPI, these are the 8 we want, and let them pick the other 8, I guess. But then you have to have a chair, and who's that chair going to be? So I want it to be somebody who's strong in dyslexia. We are the study committee on dyslexia, and this is a draft. So it's not that I want to walk away with nothing, but why can't we add a definition of dyslexia to our draft? And also the Minnesota guidebook is very weak. They even said so. The people who wrote it said so. New Jersey has a much better one. Many other states do.
Maybe it's the only thing they could agree on in the upper Midwest.
Yeah, but we already have 130 pages on struggling readers. We are the study committee on dyslexia, and we've been hijacked. And I really resent it. I'm really upset. I want people to come to the table, yes. I want their opinion. I want them to hear my opinion. But in the end, we're the study committee on dyslexia. So, and giving it all to DPI is just, nothing will happen. So could we at least get the definition of dyslexia in our draft? And I love the modules. It's free. I don't know why we can't have that, but all right if we can't. And then the guidebook, I do want a guidebook, but I want to maintain some control as to who's on the writing committee. Before you just hand it to DPI, who does nothing, knows nothing, and sees
And
nothing.
if you see my emphatic nature, it's not because I'm upset in any way, shape, or form. It's just that I'm trying to cut through and get some clarity as to what I hope to see that we do here, and that is to develop, hopefully to tweak the language on these and say, this may be as far as we can go today. But Donna, go ahead.
Other states have had editing rights by the WIBITA organizations. So, for the IDA organizations. So if the product produced is not to their satisfaction, they have editing rights that override what else is, what was put into the book.
I just I do need to refute some of the things that have been said. First of all, we do not, we have never said that dyslexia doesn't exist, to my knowledge. Barb Novak, yes, she was a past president, but when she spoke at DPI, she spoke in her role as DPI. She has always been careful to separate those two. When she was president of WSRA, she would always be clear about which hat she was speaking under. And when I made this statement about teaching phonics, what I was trying to say is that if children need phonics instruction, if they need support to be phonemically aware, then I will do that. And there are a number of ways that you can do that that are effective for those children by using one-on-one instruction, by using small group instruction, and certainly phonemic awareness and phonics, all of those things have to do with spelling. They're more than just a reading concern. They have to do with spelling. But what I'm saying is that teachers need to be able to instruct children with what they need when they need it, and to let the other children who have knowledge that they're using as readers and writers get on with that and to meet them where they are. And my concern here is at the restrictive nature of all of this, that we are taking something that applies to a certain portion of the population, and we run the risk of making it something that affects general education and all students who have civil rights as well.
A couple of points. Under the bill that we have drafted, DPI in consultation with IDA and the Wisconsin State Reading Association must review and revise the guidebook once every 3 years. So I don't believe that it is possible, and Ledge Council indicated that it's not, it would be very, very atypical to allow a private organization to have editing rights on a public document. That being said, IDA and WSRA are are organizations that can put out their own guidebooks, as many as they would like, as often as they would like, and review them as often as they would like. But that's not, and that might be completely appropriate. But this is basically saying the state, this is, legislation to affect the official guidebook, if you will. So we have to, again, be careful about those lines of designation. I guess I'd suggest that if the WSRA doesn't like the guidebook, they can put out their own. And the IDA, if they are not happy with it, they can say, hey, we love what the state did, except for these 6 things, which are absolutely dead wrong, and and they can put out their own. So I guess back to the Brenda, were you going to, or pardon me, Nancy, were you going to say something?
I had a question, and then I went to a completely different thought based on your most recent comments, but I'll flip back to my question. It appeared that we had consensus as a committee to change in the first line of the draft, or the second line, I guess, to remove reading difficulties and add related conditions, which appear to be consensus to focus the scope of this guidebook on students with dyslexia and related conditions. My question is, are there other areas of the drafted legislation which would committee members would like to update then to reflect that more narrow scope? So for example, there's references to struggling readers.
Yep. And typically, again, this is something that is done as a matter of course from legislative council. So it becomes
Sure.
a global change.
Okay.
So yes, absolutely, point understood.
So, but then my next question would be, does that lens impact the makeup of the 17 representatives that are listed on lines 19 through 15? For example, do we need a parent of a child who is a struggling reader but who is not dyslexic if the scope of our guidebook is?
If it has narrowed. Mm-hmm. Understood. Do you see any other possible deletions from that other than that one?
That's a question I'd like to put back to the committee.
Yeah, and that's appropriate. And while we had a lot of balls in the air here, and one of the things that I just wanted to suggest is relative to a definition for dyslexia, I am certainly not averse to having a second or a third piece of legislation that we can potentially vote on that defines dyslexia. I don't think to put it into the guidebook will be necessarily helpful to that process, but as a standalone piece, I think that it would be something that I would be willing to consider if the committee would want to. And I don't think that that would be a really difficult piece of legislation to be put together. We'd probably have to kind of decide on which definition, but Senator Shatner.
I have a question. I am not a reading specialist. What is the difference between reading difficulties and related conditions? I just don't even understand what that is. It makes no sense to me.
I think that was Stephen Dykstra.
So a number of children may struggle to read for a number of reasons. Some of those reasons are not related to dyslexia. They may struggle because they grew up in a home that was illiterate. I know a child who struggled dramatically to read because both of his parents were deaf, and so he didn't hear language nearly as much as he needed to as he was growing up. So he struggles to read. That's not a dyslexia-related condition. But there are other conditions which border dyslexia, which involve other aspects of language processing. So dyslexia is a condition, a neurologically based condition in which an individual struggles with the processing of sound and language and assembling sound and language into meaningful units and making it permanent. So there's two aspects to dyslexia widely agreed on in what's known as the dual deficit model. There are other kids who may appear to have dyslexia who actually have other much less common disorders. It's not unlike ADHD in the sense that a lot of kids look like they have ADHD when you find out that a small subset of them don't really have ADHD, they have something else. And you might call it an ADHD sort of related condition or a similar condition. Some of that gets into some diagnostic finery that's probably beyond the scope of our discussion here. For most of those kids, though, who have what I would describe as dyslexia-related conditions, for most of those children, they still respond well to the same kind of instruction. So I have a quote from one of the top experts in the world, who actually was cited by the WSRA, Linnea Airy, where she said, "There's no way to learn to read effectively without building word reading skill and a foundation of letter knowledge and phonemic awareness. This is where struggling readers have great difficulty acquiring knowledge of the writing system and applying it to read words." One of the things I want to point out, and this is a subtle difference, but it's the kind of thing that I want to draw people's attention to. The difference between waiting to see if children struggle with phonics and phonemic awareness before you provide support, and then providing support only where you can see that they struggle, is a very different way of providing education. The recommendation from the NIH, the NRP, and other organizations, and the overwhelming wealth of science is that those Those skills are best provided before the child struggles. Don't throw them in the water and see if they drown before you send them to swim lessons. You know, that it is not as effective as just providing it. Yes, children who catch on to it quickly, provide it very quickly, move them through faster, absolutely, no question about it. Kids who are, you know, if you're trying to do a whole class lesson, and the sound that B makes and how B works in spelling and how B works in different parts of the word, and you've got a child who mastered this 6 months ago and wants to read a book, let them read a book. I have no problem with it. But don't wait to see that be sure that the child knows it. Be sure that the child knows it. And those are things that need to be covered. The other thing I would say about the dyslexia guidebook is if we are going to be required to give half the seats to people who've come here and really kind of dispute the utility of the term dyslexia, and we don't really know anything about it, who describe it as opaque, we at least have to start the committee at a different point. We have to give them some guidebooks to use as a starting point. We have to give them a definition of dyslexia. I disagree with Representative Culp here. I think giving them a definition of dyslexia as a starting point would be important. I think defining their charge, their specific task, what they're supposed to do, not just tell us what you think about dyslexia. Go see what you can agree on about dyslexia. I think if we give them a better starting point, then it becomes more palatable.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I just want to say we have a screener in, we had a screener. We now have local control of the screeners that we use in pre-K, kindergarten, first and second grade. And I know that districts use that information extensively to guide instruction. That's what it's for. It's to say, okay, to give us an indication of which children know letter names, know letter sounds, have phonemic awareness through measures such as rhyming, to look at writing. All of those things inform our instruction and help us to target instruction early on. And I know in my district, we had those screeners before PALS, which was the screener chosen by the Read to Lead Task Force, and still is in use in many districts. We had screeners that we used before that was even mandated because we wanted to make sure that the instruction that we delivered matched student needs. And we don't wait. I mean, I work with kindergartners. And I make sure that I use what they know and to help them to learn what they need to know. That's what good instruction is. It's responsive to children, and we need to have assessments that guide our instruction and help us to target instruction to the students when they need it and not wait for them to fail.
Thank you. Anne?
I'd like to defer to Dr. Dykstra.
Dr. Dykstra?
I'm glad to hear that you support screening, but, and I'm sorry if this seems overly confrontational, I would like to read the WSRA's official response to the proposal of broad screening for children for early reading difficulties, specifically for dyslexia. They wrote, screening devices such as described in the bill have been misrepresented. Over the years, this type of device has misrepresented many students, yielding both false negative and false positive predictions of reading failure. No other professional organization in the literacy field, such as the International Reading Association or the National Council of Teachers of English Language Arts, have endorsed this type of screening. So I'm glad to see that they're using this screening, but the official position of the WSRA was that we should not screen. And that's part of our concern, is that legacy of the organization looms heavily over this whole process.
I stepped out, but to understand from legislative council that we, and the vice chair, that we may have kind of veered off course from looking at this, legislation. Back to the way the members are picked, what if we did something like have each chair, obviously, the chair from DPI selects from the three names, one co-chair from each side, and then there are 8 names submitted, and that's it. In other words, not leaving it up for, any mystery that way. Because, I guess I don't want to lose focus of what we're trying to do here. And I'll post the question to all of you. Will parents and kids and teachers and administrators be better set up to help kids with dyslexia with this guidebook, or if we don't get the guidebook done? I hope that's a self-evident question. I hope that the guidebook is going to be helpful. That's why we're doing it. So I guess if that's the case, then I see we need to make sure that we get that done in one fashion or the other. So back to the first question that I had when I came back, what if each co-chair picks 8 members? These are the 8. DPI doesn't do the selecting at that level. Is that something that you could all vote yes for?
Without specifying any roles or categories.
Without specifying roles or categories is what Ledge Council just indicated as well. And then you could, if the categories, of course, are going to be self-evident and are going to be important to each one of the groups, you can say, look, we want a child of a struggling reader on there, or any number of things. But that gives full autonomy to the groups to do that. My guess is each group, as they submit the 3 names to DPI to be chosen, the one from, there will be a de facto committee within that group, I would think, within that association, that would, kind of work together on, okay, now who are we going to pick? So it's not just one person. Is that a compromise where we could actually strike out a good share of the prescriptive members and allow the individual entity or the person that's chosen to make those decisions? Ann?
Why do we have to have 3 names for the chairperson and then DPI picks? If we're going to go this route, why can't we each recommend our chairperson and our 7 other names? And I do think we still need some guidance as to who should be on it in terms of the qualifications, but
But will you not self-qualify, kind of?
Right.
well,
No, the state actually trusts associations to make good decisions, so.
you do want a researcher, you do want a parent of a dyslexic. I mean, I think both sides maybe should have to stay within certain guidelines as to who can go on it. Stephen?
I think if we believe that a parent of a dyslexic child is important, to be perfectly blunt, I don't know if the WSRA can come up with the parent of a dyslexic child who would be acceptable to them.
Okay, but I would like to have,
And I don't
I would
think they
like
should
us to
have
pick the
to.
chairs.
Yeah, I think every group picking their own chairs, I think is a good idea.
It's a good idea.
Otherwise, I know who I want for our chair, it's not me, and I would just submit that person's name 3 times.
I didn't think of that.
I would, their name under, and then 2 other aliases, and then they get picked.
And could we go back to being the study on dyslexia? Can we add the definition of dyslexia to our bill? And if the guidebook is on dyslexia, why can't we have a definition of dyslexia in the guidebook?
Understood. Let's take the first piece, and then we'll definitely come back to the definition.
Thank you.
You have my word of honor on that.
All right.
The difficulty with having only one name submitted for DPI is basically at that point, you are I don't know how to put it, but ceding too much it's just simply not done that way, where now you have a private entity that is making all of the decisions, or a private association. There has to be some ability from the state's perspective, and that again is from legislative council. And I would tend to concur with that. And I would think that within the IDA and within the WSRA, you have three equally qualified people. And as I stated before, I believe that within that you can have a collaboration. I'm not doing this job as chair in a vacuum, and neither would that person that's selected be doing it in a vacuum. So I think that piece needs to remain. I think you've indicated that we could do 8 names and self-select. I think that's something that I would hope would have the blessing and the potential upvote of this committee at some point. Yeah, a straw poll is a good idea, and that is a suggestion from Ledge Council. I saw a nod of head with you, Ann, or go ahead. Let's just, yeah.
I'd like more discussion on this because I think WSRA will just send 8 reading specialists who don't think dyslexia exists, or
Then it will be a
I
really
shouldn't
fun
be
discussion.
belief, it is science, but I think we do need some, I mean, each of us should perhaps, I don't know, these things come up so fast with little time to think about it or talk amongst ourselves.
Welcome to the legislature.
And again, I do want WSRA to have a place at the table, but how is it that they have a place at the microphone when I have a parent back here of a dyslexic child who's prepared a statement? She would love to talk to you. I mean, how is it that there are other stakeholders that do not sit at the table and do not have as much time? I don't understand that.
Well, and as I said before, this is the process of legislative council, and has been for, what is it, close to 100 years, I think. And so we don't want to change it today, because I'd be breaking new ground and we'd be making news. And this is not the final finished product. That the young lady who's, I believe, prepared a statement will be more than able to do that at the public hearing when this is actually introduced as legislation. And we would welcome that. I got to tell you that, thinking about this thing from a political perspective, and this is not R or D behind the name, but the way things get done in the Capitol is you have, if you have a hearing on a bill and you fill that room with 150 or 200 or 300 people that all want to have their say, that's the kind of pressure that really gets the attention of legislators. So that time will be there to have that. I really think that's a very effective way to get the job done. So it's not that we're trying to shut off good conversation. It's just that it's not the time and the place for that, because that time is coming and will come. So, Senator Vice Chair Schottner, you were going to say something.
It seems like, to me, in my humble opinion, that the biggest problem here is trust. And we have to really trust that as this process goes forward, that the process will shake itself out. And I think that that is all due to the makeup of the committee. So I am very encouraged. I hope that when this committee is made up and this product comes out, that both sides are heard and all voices are listened to, and we come up with a product that everyone can walk away with. It's obvious that there's high passion, and that's okay. And I think that we have to, at the end of the day, go back to the beginning. This is for kids. There are a lot of adults in the room here. We have one child. This is ultimately for kids. It's adult opinions, but however this shakes out, it's for kids. And sometimes we as adults have to take our passion and take a step back and really look at what is best for kids.
Thank you for that. Just thinking about something that Donna mentioned early on about a module. Should we add a line in this guidebook that says that the guidebook should contain a training module, not make it mandatory, but make it something that is part of the charge of this guidebook committee to have a learning module that they can pick from some other state, as was indicated, there are others that did that. Is that something that would make this more or less agreeable to members of the committee? Go ahead.
I think it would be great. I have some of the same concerns about that I have about other things. I certainly take Senator Shackner's comments about trust to heart. In the interest of establishing some trust, I'd like to ask you if you can say on behalf of the WSRA that the long-held position of the WSRA that phonemic awareness, that the importance of phonemic awareness was a myth that they compared to stories of giant alligators in sewers. That was your number one advocacy position for over a decade, that was a bad decision.
And I don't know that we're necessarily here to litigate those past.
But if we want to establish trust, this is an opportunity for somebody to say, yeah, we were wrong about that.
Well, point understood, and I don't know, do you want to answer that? You don't have to, because I'll, as the chair, say that it's not the time and place for that if you'd care not to. But if you want to quickly, we can do that and then move on.
I just would like to say one thing in response to that, and that is that the process, literacy as a process is complex. And we have as belief statements at WSRA, expertise matters, research grounds us, and literacy is a complex process that requires a comprehensive approach and a mindset shift. It is complex. And we don't, and I think I can speak for others, but I know I don't think that there is any one way to teach all children. I think that human variation means that different children need different things at different times in their lives. And that is what we work on, is developing our professional learning so that we can work with all children where they are, with what they need, at the time that they need it.
I am looking at the clock and saying we are scheduled to take a break at noon and trying to decide what direction to take here relative to this first piece of legislation. Let's do the straw poll on if there are only 8 names submitted rather than 20 that DPI gets to pick from. On that concept and that concept alone, Stephen Dykstra, yes or no?
Yes.
Representative Rohrcast?
Yes.
Senator Schottner?
Yes.
Yes.
Donna? Nancy?
May I ask a question?
We'll come back to your question. So we'll, on Ann, yes or no?
Yes.
Representative Stuck?
I say I don't know yet, I guess we have to.
Okay. Back to you, Nancy.
I'm wondering if Ledge Council has a recommendation for a way to also allow for public application to the committee, because I would hate to limit it to only people that have an affiliation with 2 organizations to participate in the process. I would hope that there would be people who have no affiliation with either organization but represent what's best for students that would be great representatives in the process. So I'm, curious if there's a recommendation that some seats are filled by IDA, some by WSRA, and then there's a third set of seats that is open for public application and maybe selected by the co-chairs or And I'm also curious about a balance in roles, because I do think one of the things that we agreed upon that made Minnesota successful was that they had representation from such a wide group of roles, from speech therapists to regular education teachers and reading specialists and parents and pupils and brain scientists. And I think depending on two organizations will not give us that balance in roles that we initially intended.
Answer the question relative to the public.
Whatever the
Participation.
committee agrees on.
Okay, so there would be precedence for that in different committees where, or task
No.
forces, or, no? Okay.
It would- I guess probably the thing to point out is that Minnesota's Department of Education went through this process without a statute in place. So, speaking of trust, I think that this committee is desirous of directing something to happen in the Department of Public Instruction, and the statute has to be directed at that public entity, the DPI. So DPI will select the members, but you can specify whatever categories you wish and whatever charge you wish for that committee. At the end of the day, this is an advisory committee that submits to DPI an advisory draft that DPI can then take action. So this statutory changes will be for the purpose of directing state action. I know that doesn't fully answer all of the questions the committee has to decide on, but whatever the committee decides, it's within those parameters, if that helps.
Just as,
Go ahead.
just as kind of a follow-up to that comment, so there could be an application for public membership, but there would still need to be a decider
Yes.
for which one of those members would be on the committee, and that would more typically in legislation be decided by a state entity.
Do I understand correctly that the committee would write a document which would be treated as a draft, which would then be turned over to DPI, and DPI could choose to accept it, change it, do whatever they wanted with it?
Is that correct,
Yes.
legislative council? Yes, that is correct.
Then I have to share something. We've all seen the graph. I know we've seen it. I've seen it more than you because I made the graph that shows how our ranking has plummeted over the years. In this building, a month after I first generated those statistics and others, we sat down with representatives from DPI and said, what do you think about this? Now, we were all here when they said about that. When we asked them why this is happening, they said, we don't know. That's big progress, because 9 years ago when we talked to them about it, their exact quote was, we don't care. It concerns me that this is ultimately going to land in the hands of DPI, because that's the DPI that I've seen over and over again. That concerns me. That hangs over the head of this whole thing.
Now, what could DPI, and this is a question for Ledge Council, could DPI make wholesale changes to this guidebook in the way we have it written? And is it possible to have it be more tightly drafted where they could not make changes?
I would probably need to consult with our drafting experts on that question. I think that what you've seen in the past where there are situations where the legislature wishes to direct something to occur and doesn't feel confident in a certain agency as it's currently composed to carry that out, there are instances in which they'll give it to a different agency. But it needs to be a state agency. Right, and DCF is where the reading aid grants occurred, so.
So if a committee that's chosen by the entities that we've talked about puts together a guidebook, DPI could, if it has 12 chapters, DPI could take 11 chapters and throw them out the door?
So the guidebook and the committee in this draft is directed and composed by DPI, and then the draft is taken by DPI and either adopted in that form or adopted in a different form. They have to publish something in the nature of a guidebook with the required contents. It does not have to resemble the draft that's submitted to them by this committee, the advisory committee.
You would hope that it would, and you're suggesting, I guess, yeah, I need to think about that a little bit. Because as Senator Shatner pointed out, we are a little bit lacking in terms of trust here. And, you know, I am not. I believe that DPI has best interests in mind of parents and of children and of, and I think they do their best. And I would hope that they would take this council's or this advisory committee's input seriously and publish the document without wholesale changes to it. Donna, do you want to say something?
The other thing is
Yep.
private organizations with their representatives can then post the draft everywhere they want to.
Yeah, and that is,
And
that
they
is,
submit.
yeah.
The other thing that's in the draft is that this draft, I'm sorry, the draft we are looking at directs the advisory committee to submit its draft of the guidebook, just to clarify which drafts. Submit its draft to DPI as well as to the education standing committees in the legislature. And so it's made public at that time, to the extent that the publicity matters to the committee. You should be aware that it will become a public draft that was produced. That'll be the product of the committee. What DPI publishes after that is up to DPI.
And
But
that-
it's not like they can hide that guidebook.
Yeah, and that is actually a very good point. That is a check and balance that you have. The light of public scrutiny is probably bigger than anything else. And if you have 150 parents coming into a room saying, you know, the association that helped me out with my child said this, and this is what DPI did, then at that point, the public pressure certainly comes to bear. So I actually like that as a check and balance. Appreciate you pointing that out, Legislative Council. Donna?
So historically, I mean, Wisconsin is a hands-off. Every district does what they want to do. Are we going to continue with that, or are we going to take the suggestions of the guidebook seriously and promote them? So is it a guidebook, or is it you need to do this? What is that going to look like?
The way I envision the guidebook, and I believe the way the draft is, the draft legislation that we're hopefully going to vote on at some point is designed is to be a guidebook, not a mandate. And that's one of the things that I have heard from a number of stakeholders, is that they are in support of this because it is not another mandate. And there may be a time when that is appropriate. I don't know that that's within the purview of what, it's probably within the scope of, but not within the purview of what we're going to be able to get done in this time. So that's, Senator Shatner.
It's step one. I think that's to clarify, it's step one.
Are there any modifications that we want to direct Legislative Council to make over their lunch hour? I don't know if that was necessarily going to be, I'm speaking for your lunch, and you both look like you could use it. But-
We eat fast. If I may just review the changes that I have written down, and Julia can add anything that she has to add. I know that we took down that you would like throughout the draft, beginning with the relating clause, to change it from a guidebook related to reading difficulties and dyslexia to a guidebook related to dyslexia and related conditions. And that'll be throughout, so all of the references that have similar language would be changed. And then it appeared that there's also consensus to change the nature of the selection of committee members from a submission by each organization of 20 names and a selection by DPI of 8 out of the 20 for each side, so to speak, to simply a submission of 3 names for the chair, DPI selects 1 chair, and so there are co-chairs from IDA and from WSRA, and then each of those selects 8 members that they bring without further conditions.
And just to follow up on that, that would mean that we would be deleting the categories of members, all of the categories of members.
It would be up to the individual organizations to assure.
To make sure that there was a representative.
That's correct.
Representative Stuck, I think you wanted to say something.
2 things. I guess I just want to share, I'm somewhat concerned about getting rid of that list. I mean, I guess, I do want to make sure there are actually people with dyslexia at the table and not having people make decisions for them that don't know, or parents, but I also do want to make sure we do have educators there and people, again, who know what they're talking about at the table. So I guess I'll just mention that. I don't necessarily know that I'm saying I won't vote for it if we don't have that, but I guess I just want to raise it that I am a little concerned about that. Also, I did have an amendment drafted to bring to the table on this, just in terms of saying that, in terms of who can't be there, would be somebody who is basically just trying to sell a product and making sure that they're not at the tables, that we just are attracting the right people who are really in the interest of children, not really trying to promote a certain product. So I don't know if that's something to talk about now or at a different point.
I think it is. Certainly, it's an appropriate point of discussion. Any input on that relative to the, yeah? I'm seeing heads nod.
I think that's a great idea. We did
Yeah.
have one person speak to us during our meetings who sells a product.
Yeah.
So I don't think we
Yep. I'm seeing heads nodding in agreement that makes sense. I think
I don't know
that's,
if that can just be written in, or if we need that, an actual amendment for
no,
that.
I'm sure that it can be just folded into the,
It depends how you want to vote on it. I mean, you can have us fold it into the draft we have, if that's the consensus of the committee already, or you can vote on it separately from the draft if you wish.
I don't know that I can read a group of people well, but I think I read that everyone is saying it could be part of the main document and voted at one time. Am I correct in that? I think I'm seeing yes.
It's not that people who sell products don't have a lot to offer, but it inherently detracts from people's faith in the final,
Yeah.
in the final report.
Understood. Thanks for bringing that, Representative Stuck. That's a good idea.
I would also like to suggest, while you're stepped out, one of the things I suggested, so I disagree with you a little bit. I think it would be helpful to start with a definition as a starting point. I think asking the committee to write, the drafting committee to write a guidebook with no definition as a starting point. I think giving them a definition as a starting point and giving them potentially 3 guidebooks as examples of the kinds of things that we might be looking for is good and erases some of the early difficult work that might need to go on. Gives them a head start. One of the advantages of being one of the last states to do this is you can piggyback off the work other people have done. So I think we should do that.
Legislative Council had some input there, and I'll just let Jessica describe
Just to
that.
relay drafting discussions we had with the drafter, a definition is typically put into statute as a tool that's used in a different action that's prescribed in the statute. So it will also apply then to all requirements in statute that refer to that term. And it would affect special education statutes and requirements that schools need to meet if you define this term, because the definition is there for directing some action, so that's how it will be interpreted. It will direct and inform the requirements relating to special education, unless you put it in some walled-off standalone corner. There's no definition section of statutes with just
I'm not
defined
talking about writing a statute that says, for the state of Wisconsin, this is the definition of dyslexia. I'm talking,
But we don't control what courts decide about what definitions apply where.
And that, I was having a conversation with Julia outside for just a minute, and we were talking about doing that as standalone. You know, it may be just a wonderful time to take a lunch break and to regroup here a bit, but what I would envision for this afternoon is hopefully having a vote on this, either up or down, on the guidebook and the changes that we've made to it, then also taking up the dyslexia specialist, and hopefully that is not as complex or as thorny an issue. If it is, trust me, we're not going to be out of here at 2 p.m. And then hopefully having some further direction on the definition, and because I need to understand what was just being said here. We have a choice. We can, it's 5 minutes after noon. We have our schedule heats us, lights us back up at 1 p.m. I guess I'm fine to do that if that's what works, if everyone needs 55 minutes. If we can come back 15 minutes earlier, I'm okay with that as well. But let's just do 1 o'clock and we'll just go. Yeah, yeah, sounds good. So we'll stand informal for